Picture this. A guy from a coal town in West Virginia takes a DNA test and flies to Scotland on holiday, expecting to feel like a tourist. Instead, a geneticist tells him something that stops him cold. Genetically speaking, he is, in certain specific ways, more Old Scotland than many people currently living in Glasgow. Not culturally, not by accent or passport. Genetically. His ancestors left the British Isles 300 years ago, and somehow, impossibly, they became a cleaner snapshot of the homeland than the homeland itself. That should not be possible. The people who stayed home are the ones who never left, so they should hold the real, untouched version of the bloodline. The ones who crossed an ocean and disappeared into the Appalachian Mountains for 10 generations should be the diluted copy, right? That is the assumption almost everyone carries around. And according to the actual genetic data, it may be backwards. Here's where the story really begins. In 2015, a team of geneticists at Oxford completed an 18-year study of the British population. They collected DNA from more than 2,000 people, each chosen specifically because all 4 grandparents had lived within roughly 50 miles of the same rural village. The goal was straightforward: reconstruct the genetic map of Britain before modern migration and urbanization scrambled it. What they found challenged a great deal of what appears in standard history textbooks. But here is the part almost nobody discusses. When separate researchers later compared that British genetic map with the DNA of certain Americans, specifically descendants of colonists who arrived before 1700, something genuinely strange appeared in the data. In a handful of very specific American regions, including Appalachia, the old Tidewater counties, and pockets of rural New England, the genetic signature of Old Britain appeared sharper, more concentrated, and in some ways better preserved than the equivalent signature found in parts of Britain today. That sounds backwards. The British live in Britain. The Americans in question live 3,000 miles away, across an ocean, and their families have lived there for almost 400 years. So how did the descendants end up preserving a piece of the homeland more clearly than the homeland preserved it for itself? Stay with me for the next few minutes, because if you have ever taken a DNA test and seen a large percentage of England, Scotland, or Ireland appear in your results, and quietly assumed that number meant less than it would for somebody actually living there today, you may be about to discover that the assumption is exactly backwards. This video is going to do 3 things. First, we are going to examine the actual genetic research and the real peer-reviewed studies, and lay out exactly what the DNA evidence shows about the relationship between modern Britain and Americans of British descent. No clickbait, no speculation dressed up as science. Second, we are going to explain why a population transported across an ocean and effectively frozen in place can sometimes preserve older ancestral patterns more clearly than the homeland, because the homeland kept mixing, while the transplanted population did not. This is not statistical sleight of hand. It is a documented and well-understood phenomenon in population genetics, and it has been observed in populations ranging from Quebec and Iceland to Amish communities in Pennsylvania. Third, we are going to arrive at a specific and concrete implication for you personally. If your family reached colonial America before the early 1700s, and if your roots passed through Appalachia, the Tidewater, New England, or the Scots-Irish migration corridor, your DNA may be carrying a version of the British Isles that modern Britain has partly blurred out of existence. This is not a story about who is more British than whom. That framing is lazy, and honestly, it misses the entire point. This is a story about how migration can freeze a moment in time, how a homeland continues changing regardless, and how the genetic record of an entire population can, under the right conditions, survive more clearly among descendants who left than among relatives who stayed behind. If you are new here, this is exactly what this channel does. We investigate the genetic and historical roots of the English-speaking world and tell the story directly without the political noise that usually becomes tangled around this subject. If that is the kind of investigation you are looking for, subscribe. There are already hours of related material waiting for you. Now, back to the actual science. For most of the 20th century, the working assumption in this field was simple. Want to study British ancestry? Study Britain. The British had lived on those islands for centuries. Their families had not crossed an ocean, and their bloodlines were assumed to remain essentially intact. Americans, by comparison, were treated as the diluted version, a melting pot of immigrant populations blended together across 4 centuries of shared settlement. At the time, that made intuitive sense. The British Isles were the source. America was the offshoot. If researchers wanted clean reference data showing what the original English, Welsh, Scottish, or Irish populations looked like genetically, they sampled the source directly. This was the exact framework early consumer DNA companies used when building their reference panels, and it was also the framework many academic geneticists began with. To be fair, for quite a long time it worked reasonably well. Researchers could identify broad ancestry, distinguish Irish, English, and Scottish populations at a general level, and roughly map the major historical movements of European peoples. But there was a real flaw built into that framework, and it took until the early 2000s for the field to see it clearly. The flaw was this: modern Britain isn't a time capsule. The British population living there today isn't a frozen sample of medieval ancestry sitting untouched. It has been moving, mixing, and absorbing new arrivals continuously for hundreds of years. The Britain of 1620, the Britain that sent the Pilgrims across to Plymouth, was genetically not quite the same population you would sample by walking into a London pub today. Said out loud, that sounds obvious, but the implications are enormous, because if the homeland kept changing while part of its population was transported overseas and locked into isolated communities, the descendants of those emigrants might, in specific and measurable ways, be preserving an older genetic snapshot than the homeland itself managed to retain. That is exactly the direction the genetic research began pointing. Let's start with the foundational study. In 2015, the journal Nature published a paper titled "The Fine-Scale Genetic Structure of the British Population." The lead author was Stephen Leslie, and the broader project is usually referred to as POBI, short for People of the British Isles. The team collected DNA from roughly 2,000 rural Britons, whose grandparents had all lived in the same local area, giving researchers a genetic snapshot of Britain largely as it existed before the heavy industrial era migrations of the 19th and 20th centuries scrambled everything. The results were remarkable. Britain wasn't one unified population at all. It turned out to be a patchwork of 17 genetically distinct clusters. Cornwall and Devon, separated only by the River Tamar, appear genetically distinct from one another. Welsh populations divided clearly into northern and southern clusters, tracing almost exactly onto the boundaries of old medieval Brythonic kingdoms. Orkney carried a clear and unmistakable Norwegian Viking genetic signature. Southeastern England carried more continental Germanic DNA than any other region on the island, precisely where historical Anglo-Saxon settlement had been densest. There was no single unified Celtic genetic group at all. The populations we casually group together as Celtic, including the Welsh, Cornish, Scottish Highlanders, and Irish, turned out to be genetically distinct from one another. This was a genuine revelation. British ancestry isn't one single thing. It is a deeply layered, regional, and structured inheritance, and any honest genetic analysis has to respect that underlying structure rather than flattening everything into one average number. Now layer a second study on top of that one. In 2022, another Nature paper, this one led by Joshua Gretzinger, analyzed ancient DNA recovered from early medieval English burial sites. The researchers sequenced hundreds of skeletons dating to the Anglo-Saxon period. What they found was that early medieval English populations carried roughly 76% continental Northern European ancestry. Modern English populations carry meaningfully less of that same signature today, somewhere between a quarter and a half, depending on the specific region sampled. Stop and actually sit with what that means. The modern English population continued mixing with the indigenous Britons who were already there, with later arrivals, with Irish migrants during the industrial era, with continental refugees, and most recently with large-scale global immigration over the past 70 years. The original Anglo-Saxon genetic peak has, in a purely statistical sense, been partially diluted across the following 15 centuries. Now bring in the third part of the picture. In 2017, a team led by Eunjung Han at 23andMe published a study analyzing the DNA of more than 770,000 individuals across North America. They identified clear and distinct genetic clusters within the United States that mapped closely onto colonial-era migration patterns: a Scots-Irish Appalachian cluster, a New England Puritan cluster, a Tidewater cluster, a Pennsylvania Quaker cluster. These weren't vague or blurry groupings. They were sharp, statistically robust, and clearly distinguishable, reflecting populations that had remained relatively endogamous, meaning they married largely within the same group for 10 to 15 consecutive generations. Put these three findings together: the POBI map of regionally structured Britain, the Gretzinger evidence of centuries of post-Anglo-Saxon mixing, and the 23andMe map of distinct colonial American clusters. A genuinely strange picture begins to emerge. The colonial American clusters don't align perfectly with the modern British average. They align more closely with specific regional and historical British populations than with modern Britain as a whole. That is the finding that changes the entire conversation. There's a well-established concept in population genetics called the founder effect. The basic idea is simple. When a small group breaks away from a larger population and begins reproducing mostly within itself, the genetic profile of that small founding group becomes effectively locked in place. Whatever genetic variation existed among the founders becomes the new baseline. Future generations then carry that baseline forward largely unchanged, because the gene pool remains small and relatively isolated. This isn't theoretical. It has been documented across dozens of populations around the world. The Quebecois, descended from roughly 8,500 original French settlers, carry a distinctive genetic signature that no longer exists at the same concentration anywhere in modern France. Afrikaners in South Africa preserve 17th-century Dutch genetic patterns more clearly than the modern Netherlands does, precisely because the Netherlands continued absorbing new arrivals while the Afrikaner population remained relatively closed. The Amish of Pennsylvania carry an 18th-century German Palatinate signature that has since been substantially altered within Germany itself by 2 more centuries of continued migration and mixing. Now apply that exact same logic to colonial America. Between 1620 and 1700, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 people crossed the Atlantic from the British Isles. They arrived in distinct waves, and each wave came overwhelmingly from one specific region. The Puritans of New England came mostly out of East Anglia. The Cavaliers and indentured servants of the Tidewater came largely from southern and southwestern England. The Quakers of Pennsylvania came mostly from the North Midlands, and the Scots-Irish, who arrived in the largest single wave between 1717 and 1775, came out of the Ulster plantation and the border country straddling Scotland and northern England before pushing inland to settle Appalachia. Once these groups landed, geography did the rest of the work. Mountains, rivers, distance, religion, and language kept these communities relatively isolated from one another and from the wider world. The Appalachian Scots-Irish in particular married within their own tightly connected communities for generation after generation, often in valleys remote enough that the outside world barely reached them until well into the 20th century. The same pattern held true in parts of rural New England and among the old Tidewater families. These were textbook founder populations, small initial gene pools, high rates of marriage within the group, real geographic isolation, and strong cultural insularity, all locked in place for, in some cases, 10, 12, or even 14 consecutive generations. Meanwhile, back across the Atlantic, the homeland kept moving. This is the part most people never really stop to consider. The Britain of 1620 sent its emigrants across to America, and then Britain itself simply kept going. It didn't pause, and it didn't freeze in place. The 17th century gave way to the 18th, and Britain industrialized rapidly. The 19th century arrived, and millions of Irish migrants poured into England during the Great Famine, fundamentally reshaping the populations of cities like Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow. Internal migration shattered many of the old regional gene pools. Rural populations moved into factory towns. Welsh mining communities mixed with English labourers, and Scottish Highlanders displaced by the clearances scattered across the lowlands and into growing industrial cities. By the 20th century, Britain had absorbed successive waves of Eastern European Jewish migration and Italian migration, followed, after 1945, by large-scale immigration from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa. None of this is a value judgment of any kind. It is simply demographic fact. Modern Britain is a richly mixed society, and its genetic signature today reflects exactly that. So, when a geneticist samples a random modern Briton and tries to use that person as a stand-in for what East Anglian DNA actually looked like in 1620, there is a genuine problem. Modern Britain is genetically descended not only from the East Anglian Puritans who stayed home, but also from 3 additional centuries of continuing admixture layered directly on top of that original population. Their DNA is essentially a layered cake. The 1620 layer is still there somewhere, but it sits beneath a great deal of newer material. Meanwhile, descendants of the Puritans who crossed the Atlantic and then remained inside small, tightly connected Massachusetts communities for generations can carry DNA closer to a clean, single slice of that original 1620 layer, because comparatively little additional ancestry was added on top of it during the intervening centuries. The exact same logic applies to the Scots-Irish settlers of Appalachia. Their ancestors came from one specific corner of the British Isles, with the Anglo-Scottish borderlands and Ulster, within a relatively narrow historical window. Their descendants settled in the hollows of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee, then married largely within their own communities for roughly 2 centuries afterward. The genetic makeup of the Anglo-Scottish borders as it existed around the year 1700 may, in certain specific respects, be better preserved today in a coal mining family from West Virginia than in a modern resident of Glasgow. That is possible precisely because Glasgow absorbed substantial Irish, Highland, and continental European ancestry during the intervening centuries. None of this is an exotic or fringe theory. It is the predictable outcome of basic population genetics applied honestly to documented history, and the academic data, when examined closely, tends to support this general pattern. The real finding isn't that Americans are somehow more British than British people themselves. The real finding is that for certain specific regional ancestries tied to particular historical moments, the descendants who left may have retained a tighter, less mixed version of that ancestry than the homeland that continued changing around it. History froze one population in place, Britain, meanwhile, kept moving forward. If you've taken a DNA test and your results showed heavy British and Irish ancestry, and your family tree traces back to a colonial era arrival, this next part is specifically for you. If your ancestors arrived before 1700 and you can locate them in Plymouth Colony records, Massachusetts Bay records, Jamestown rolls, or early Maryland land grants, your DNA may be carrying an East Anglian or Southern English signature that has since become less concentrated inside modern England itself. If your family came over with the Quaker migration into Pennsylvania between roughly 1675 and 1715, your DNA might preserve a North Midlands signature that was later heavily reshaped by industrial era migration in cities like Manchester and Birmingham. If your roots run through Appalachia, through places such as the Cumberland Gap, the Smoky Mountains, the hills of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee, and western North Carolina, you may carry a Scots-Irish borderland signature tracing back to a population whose original homeland was transformed by 3 centuries of urbanization, displacement, and continuing migration. And if your line traces specifically to the New England Puritans, you may genuinely be among the clearest living genetic samples of 17th century East Anglian Puritan ancestry, still surviving anywhere in the world. Not because you are special in any inherent sense, but because your ancestors remained inside a relatively closed gene pool for 14 consecutive generations, while East Anglia itself continued evolving without them. This is exactly what the data suggests, and it's why the Anglo-colonial origins of millions of Americans aren't merely a footnote attached to British history. They are a genuine parallel branch of it, a branch that, in certain specific respects, still preserves details the main trunk has gradually blurred or lost. Now, we have to be completely honest here, because honesty is the only thing that gives any of this real weight. Most Americans today are not purely descended from colonial-era stock. The overwhelming majority of the country carries ancestry from later waves of European immigration, including Germany, Italy, Poland, Scandinavia, and post-famine Ireland. There's also substantial African, Indigenous American, Latin American, and Asian ancestry woven throughout the broader population. The colonial founder communities we've been discussing are a real and well-documented demographic phenomenon, but they represent only a minority of modern Americans overall. Anyone claiming that Americans as a whole form some perfectly preserved British population is selling you a fantasy, plain and simple. Sample bias is another genuine concern, and it's worth being completely upfront about it. The 23andMe database is not a random sample of the American population. It consists specifically of people who chose to purchase and take a consumer DNA test, which means it skews towards certain demographic groups. The Pobye study, meanwhile, deliberately selected rural Britons whose grandparents had all remained in the same local area. That gives researchers an extremely useful snapshot of older regional Britain, but it is not, and was never intended to be, representative of modern Britain as a whole. Both sampling decisions were entirely defensible given the specific research goals of each study, but you cannot casually compare the two datasets as though they were neutral, perfectly matched, apples-to-apples baselines. Each dataset was curated for a specific purpose. It's also worth remembering that consumer DNA ancestry categories are not the same thing as rigorous ancient population genetics. When a service such as Ancestry DNA or 23andMe tells you that you're 43% English, that result is a statistical estimate based on shared DNA segments compared with modern reference populations. It can be genuinely useful, but it is not a direct measurement of medieval ancestry itself. Two populations can be extremely closely related, sharing the overwhelming majority of their genetic structure, while still differing in subtle ways that a standard consumer ancestry test simply was not designed to detect. And finally, there's a philosophical point worth making explicitly. Genetic preservation is not remotely the same thing as genetic purity, and purity itself is not a scientifically meaningful concept in population genetics. Every human population that has ever existed is, and always has been, admixed. Everyone, without exception. The Anglo-Saxons were already an admixed population when they arrived in Britain. The native Britons they encountered were themselves already admixed, and the earlier Celtic-speaking populations had been layered over still older populations before them. There is no pristine, unmixed bloodline anywhere on Earth. Pretending otherwise is exactly the kind of thinking that produced some of the worst pseudoscience of the last century. The legitimate finding here is much narrower, and honestly far more interesting than any claim about purity could ever be. Under specific, identifiable historical conditions, founder populations can preserve regional ancestry signatures that become gradually blurred within the original source population through continued mixing over time. That is a real, useful, peer-reviewed insight into how population genetics works. It is not a claim about purity. It is a claim about the strange and counterintuitive direction migration and time can sometimes produce. Here is what this entire story means in practical terms. When your great-great-great-grandfather sailed out of Plymouth, Bristol, or Belfast in 1638, 1718, or 1740, He carried more than his Bible, his tools, and his trade across the Atlantic. He carried one specific slice of the genetic landscape of his homeland, from one particular village, in one particular region, at one particular moment in history. Then he and his descendants did something remarkable without ever intending to. They preserved that slice, not deliberately and not through any conscious effort, but simply by living their lives in mountains, valleys, and isolated towns where the wider world reached them only slowly for several centuries. Meanwhile, the cousins who stayed behind continued living and moving as well. They migrated into expanding cities and married Irish neighbors, French refugees, Italian immigrants, continental European Jews, and many other waves of newcomers. Their gene pool became steadily richer, more layered, and more genuinely mixed over time. That is a beautiful thing in its own right. Modern Britain is a remarkable and vibrant society, partly because of that continuing mixture. But it also means that certain older regional signatures became harder to isolate as clearly as they once could be. They were not lost entirely. They were diluted and spread more thinly across a much larger and more varied population. The 1620 East Anglian Puritan, the 1715 North Midlands Quaker, the 1740 Scots-Irish borderer, those specific regional genetic identities are harder to isolate in modern Britain today, partly because they were carried away, quite literally, by the people who chose to leave. Family DNA, in this specific sense, can preserve history in ways no textbook ever could. A grandmother in eastern Kentucky may, without ever knowing it, carry a sharper genetic record of 17th century Ulster than many people currently living in modern Belfast. A Mayflower descendant living in Vermont may preserve a clearer signal of pre-industrial East Anglia than someone walking through Norwich today. These are not romantic exaggerations disguised as science. They are the straightforward demographic outcomes of a process that has been unfolding quietly for 400 years. History doesn't live only inside libraries and archives. It also lives inside cells. It survives inside small genetic communities that broke away, crossed an ocean, and were preserved almost entirely by accident in the hollows, harbors, and homesteads of an entirely new world. They never intended to become living museums of a homeland frozen in time, but in a specific, limited, and scientifically defensible sense, that is precisely what some of them quietly became. If this is the kind of story that makes you want to examine your own family tree differently, then you're exactly the viewer this channel was built for. Subscribe, because we're doing this every week, and we're only getting started. Coming up next, we're turning the same investigative approach towards a question almost nobody asks out loud. How much genuine Anglo-Saxon ancestry survives inside the modern English population today? And what does the latest ancient DNA research actually suggest about the deep origins of the English-speaking peoples? It's a story involving warriors, kings, forgotten kingdoms, and a few genuinely uncomfortable truths that the standard textbooks would rather quietly skip past. We'll see you there.